Well, I've been writing about technocracy and speaking about it for a number of years now, as you know, and about globalization in general for decades. The thing that I talk about most is technocracy right now because I believe that is and has been the major uh, thread of history leading up to where we are today. And I do believe, starting with this great panic of 2020 that I call it, not just the pandemic, but the great panic of 2020, we have essentially a technocrat coup d'etat that's happened, not just in our country, it's the whole world. And the seriousness of this whole thing is just so immense that it's hard to get your head wrapped around it. And I'm sure some people are going to be watching this thinking, what are they talking about? How could this possibly be? But the whole world right now is laboring under the same issues that we are laboring in our country. That is the great panic of 2020. And aside from the physical virus part of it, we just kind of put that aside for a bit, the reaction to it and the control mechanisms that have been set in place since then indicates to me that the technocrats who were pushing technocracy globally have finally succeeded in springing the trap on the entire planet. And in the process, they've shut down the entire global economic system. And I can assure you from emails I get from around the world, people in other countries are looking to America again to save the world. Oh, God help us. And it's not going to be our government that does it. It's the American citizens like you and me. Somehow, we have to come up with something that's going to throw a monkey wrench in this whole thing and reject technocracy again once and for all. It was rejected back in the last century in the 40s and late 30s and 40s. We need to reject it again and knock it back into the last century and leave it there permanently. Right. I always lead to answer that question with a statement from technocracy itself. This was a movement that started back in the 1930s originally. They defined themselves. I don't need to rehash their own definition because it's still true today as it was back then. They said back then, in 1938, for instance, in the magazine they published called The Technocrat, they said technocracy is the science of social engineering. That's the first big tell here. The science of social engineering. It's the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. That's the economic flavor of this whole thing. It was not a political system. They hated politicians. They wanted to do away with the entire political structure and simply manage the economy where people live. That's where people do stuff, right? And they wanted to do it using what they called the science of social engineering. And anywhere you see somebody practicing social engineering, you're touching the heart of a technocrat. And I spent a lot of time over the years that talked about a lot about the mind of a technocrat. And I've always wanted to get in their head, not to become one, but I want to know how they think. I want to know why they think what they think. I want to understand the subtleties of what they're likely to think about some other situation that might come up. And it's not too difficult to peg a lot of people as a technocrat. For instance, you look at an Anthony Fauci, for instance, pure example of somebody who's involved in the science of social engineering. It's not about the virus, it's about social engineering. He can fold his arms and look down his nose as he stands behind the president of our country, and he can look very condescending very quickly. And there's so many people like that, the scientists in white coats or engineers, whatever, and they're standing behind the scenes saying, we have the answer here, we have the only answer. You don't have anything, but you have to listen to us. And science says you should do X, Y, and Z. Therefore, you need to do X, Y, and Z, or you are going to get punished somehow. And this is the mind of a technocrat. They're all over the place. Al Gore is a good example of a technocrat. Some of the older people that remember back to Vietnam, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, who prosecuted the Vietnam War, was a technocrat. And history books now even acknowledge this. This is the way he thought. He wanted to use the science of social engineering to prosecute a war. Didn't work out very well, did it? Yeah. So we could look back through history and see a lot of examples. You could look at Bill Gates right now. Bill Gates is the classic example. of a technocrat mind. You can look at an Elon Musk. You can look at a Eric Schmidt, ex-CEO of Google. You can look at a Jeff Bezos. These people are not communists. They're not socialists, and they're not Marxists. They're technocrats.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society.
His farewell speech just kind of dropped that out, kind of like a little teaser. He understood technocracy. He was from that era. He grew up in that era. He knew exactly what he's talking about. And the scientific elite that was rising up at that point was a great threat in his mind, was a threat to the political system. And I think that's why he said that. He was a master politician, really just in an impeccable sense. He played every possible political card that he could to get where he got. So if he understood technocracy as being a threat to the political structure, that would have alarmed him. And I think it did. I think that's why he said that. I'm not a magician, but if I was going to play a trick, I would do something over here while you never saw the trick, right? So any distraction that comes along, like BLM riots and Antifa riots and so on like that, you know, these become just a huge distraction. And people look at, whoa, look over here, what's happening? It's so outrageous. Meanwhile, back over here on the other side, the real trick is taking place and technocracy marches on. The technology back in the day of 1932, 1934 didn't exist to do what we can do today, but they knew it was coming. I've studied this and done a lot of original research and into original documents from that era to come to believe that they had a full understanding of the trajectory that technology was going to take. Part of the reason I believe that is because when they actually formulated the organization or the philosophy, the economic system, they were at Columbia University in the basement of Hamilton Hall. It's the only building at the time. But they had half the basement of Hamilton Hall dedicated to them. It was pro bono to work on this new economic system. And many of the engineers and scientists from Columbia were participating in that project. In the other half of the basement was the early iteration of IBM. Those brainiacs that created the first tabulator built it in the bottom of Hamilton Hall. And so they rubbed shoulders with these guys. These were visionaries. All of them were visionaries. They were the progressives of that day, the scientific progressives who saw where technology and computation and so on was going to go. And so when technocracy was formulated or codified, let's say, they drew on everything they knew about data and about computation and about things that could be done to track things and to catalog things. And of course, that was what the first tabulator was all about. It was mostly, well, it was punch cards, and it was able to do massive amounts of statistical analysis that the world had never seen before. And this was all the stuff they cooked into their system. Now the technology has caught up. Now they're able to do the things they only dreamed about back in 1932 plus. And it's coming back to bite us in ways that the world was not prepared to understand at all, because the whole concept of technocracy has been submerged, as you know, and the names have been changed along the way for marketing purposes. It's now mostly promoted as sustainable development, which is the United Nations program. again, an economic system. It's not a political system. It's an economic system. And these people back in the early day, they hated politicians with a passion. And they wanted, in fact, they called on Roosevelt, who was just coming in 1933, to declare himself dictator, dismiss all of the politicians in Washington, D.C., and simply implement technocracy. That's what they wanted. I'm glad he didn't take them up on it. We wouldn't be having this conversation today. But now these people are coming back as a group to reassert themselves on society, taking control of society to create a scientific dictatorship. And that's exactly where we're going. The concept of bioethics, I realize, is really difficult for a lot of people to understand until it really kind of bites them directly. It has to do with the ethics of the treatment of your body, of your biological condition. And you say, well, why is that an issue? I'll give you a personal story of why it's an issue with me. My mother grew up. She was born, I think, in 1924, something like that. And she grew up in Northern California in a day when the eugenics movement was just going crazy. Mostly centered at Berkeley, by the way, University of Cal at Berkeley. And all of the upper crust of people in the Bay Area were all into eugenics. And there was a lot of stuff going on that would just amaze you today, like forced sterilization, for instance. If somebody believed that their germline, their gene line was defective somehow, that they would produce people that didn't measure up for society, why, they should be sterilized. And if they didn't want to be sterilized, they should be sterilized anyway. You know, what the heck? So my grandmother, who was all into that sort of stuff, she believed those people at Berkeley. She had a son, firstborn, who was, as it turns out, mentally retarded, and had developed about sixth grade, something like that. Maybe, I don't know, less than that actually, but. Then she had a daughter, and that would have been his younger sister. Well, they believed that the son was genetically bad. Therefore, they reasoned that it probably will skip a generation, which means that my mother didn't have it, but my mother probably would have children that would be like him. So they said, you need to take your daughter down and get her sterilized. And they did. They took her down, basically screaming and kicking, to a hospital in the Bay Area, put her on a table, and they cut her fallopian tubes, and she was sterilized for life. She wasn't very pleased about that. You can imagine, that's not the thing that you expect your mother to do to you. And years later, another doctor examined this guy, her older brother, and determined he wasn't genetically retarded at all. But when he was born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck, and he suffered oxygen deprivation. Okay. Well, anyway, my mother could never have children. She got married. She was still very angry about not being able to have children. And that was just after the war. And a boat came over from Holland, where my birth mother was pregnant all the way over on the ship, gave birth immediately coming off the ship, and gave me up for adoption. And I happened to be adopted into this family who my mother, my adoptive mother, was forcibly sterilized by the eugenics program, these nutcakes in Northern California. And you know, that program was not disbanded until the mid-1960s. It's like you would think after Hitler and after World War II that they would have just said, guys, you're all under arrest or something, and just shut it down. They didn't. And it took all that time for activists to get it shut down in California. And there's some other states, too, that had eugenics program like that. This is the insanity of eugenics. And that, remember, the reason I tell a story is that was back in the day, in 1932, in that era, just right after, maybe it was the late 30s, that my mother was sterilized. That was right when technocracy was in its heyday. And these people didn't write about it, but they wrote about the human condition. They wrote about the science of social engineering, and the bioethics of that included your body and what they would do to you. And my takeaway after reading all their early literature, and I still see this at the United Nations today, and I still see it when Bill Gates speaks anywhere, they look at you and I as a couple of cattle, steers, in a giant feedlot where all of your food is pre-mixed and you're force-fed and you get shots with this thing and that thing and you get branded and you get pushed to this corral and pushed to that corral. And this is social engineering in their mind. This is why it's just absolutely so deadly today. You look at the bioethics movement right now. This is just a continuation of what's been going on for almost 100 years. These people have not changed. And they still look at people and say, it doesn't matter. I mean, you lose a few, you got to lose, you break a few eggs to make an omelet. They apparently just don't really care about individual human life. To me, that's astounding. It's evil. It's anti-human, isn't it? It really is anti-human. In fact, there was a book written on that a few years ago by a bioethicist who was on the good side, who wrote a book about the anti-human aspect of all of these things that we're talking about. It's incredible. The rest of the world has already pretty much fallen prey to this whole scenario. And it's important to remember that technocracy is not a political system. It's an economic system. And I know that's a little bit difficult to understand because you grew up with an economic system around us. We know it as free market economics, capitalism, free enterprise, things like that, supply and demand, price-based, money, currency, and all those sorts of things. We grew up with this, and this is all we know. They have something otherworldly in mind as an economic system. They believe that if they control all of the economic framework of the world and all the inputs and outputs, there's no need for a political system. There's no need for a system of governance, if you will. There's no need for political leaders, if you will. This has led some global scholars like Parag Khanna, professor down at the U School in public policy in Singapore, to make a major conclusion in one of his books, actually called Connectography, that the system is globalization, or vice versa. Globalization is the system. It's not, they're not making it for a dictator. They're making it as a system. The algorithm will run everything. You don't need political people to tell you, should you go here, should you go there, do this, do that. The algorithm will put you in a channel, and if you go too far left or right, pow, you're going to get a shock or something. And people say, well, that's incredible, but look at China. Look at the social credit scoring system over there right now. And if you don't understand it, you better, because that's the kind of control by algorithm that these people are talking about. You don't need to be governed in a sense. It doesn't matter who's above you. They can call themselves anything they want. They could say they're National Socialist. They could say that they're hardcore Marxist. It doesn't matter what they call themselves at the top. The people on the bottom are not being controlled by those tyrants directly. They're being controlled by algorithm. You get a ticket for jaywalking in China, you'll have the ticket deducted from your checking account or your bank account before you get back to your apartment, because facial recognition watches you, it identifies you as you walk across the street. The fine is calculated based on how many other times you might have done it or other things that you have. And they just go ahead, you're guilty, we've got you on tape. Bang, there's 50 yuan or something coming out of your bank account. And by the way, your social credit score just went down 100 points. And you get a notice in a few days that you have to move out of the apartment that you're in because you're not qualified for that apartment anymore. Your social credit score is too low. And you go, oh no, where am I going to live? And then you get a notice you can't go to that school. You're kicked out of the school you're in because that school's reserved for good little citizens that don't jaywalk. Yeah, you get the picture. This is not, it doesn't matter whether there's a committee anywhere. There aren't any committees, really. Once the algorithm's in place, it's push the button or, click run program, and there you go. And it happens. But going back to 1973, when the Trilateral Commission was founded, this is what they put in motion when they said they will create a new international economic order. They didn't say they were going to create a government order. They were going to create an New International Economic Order, and they called it that. It was all over their literature. And lo and behold, in 1974, the United Nations passed a resolution to create the New International Economic Order. Whoa. Okay, it just so happened that the Rockefeller people that started the Trilateral Commission had a great relationship with the UN forever, and they fed it to the UN and the next year that they came into being. This New International Economic Order was not understood by anybody back then, including myself and Anthony Sutton. We just didn't get it. We knew that it was a big deal. We knew that globalization was upon us, but we didn't fully understand it meant technocracy. There was no view of technocracy back in our minds in that day. If there had been, we would have pegged it right then, I'm certain. But this was what they had in mind. And all of these global elitists that were in the Trilateral Commission, they basically took over the industrialized world political system. Certainly in America they did, with Jimmy Carter. It wasn't that they wanted political power. And I've demonstrated this in my books and my papers and so on ever since. What they were after was control over the economic engine of the world, which was clearly represented by the United States at that time. We were the big kingpins. And so 8 out of 10, for instance, of the World Bank directors after that time were all members of the Trilateral Commission. Lo and behold, the World Bank, well, the President of the United States appoints the World Bank president. That's the way it is. And you had the same thing with the U.S. trade representatives. Something like 9 out of 12 of subsequent U.S. trade representatives that have written all these cockeyed treaties since 1933, they were members of the Trilateral Commission. It wasn't about getting the presidency. It wasn't about getting the EPA or some other agency under the control. They wanted control of the global economic system so that they could create a new international economic order. What I'm documenting in my work today is they had in mind back then, and forevermore have had in mind, technocracy. This was the economic system that they were after. It's the only economic system, by the way, in the course of all of history that has been an alternative economic system to free enterprise. That has always been the type of economic system the world has labored under. Technocracy is new, it's otherworldly. And once they saw the possibilities of what it could do for them, they began to put it all into play. And one of the very first things they did, by the way, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission and worked for Jimmy Carter, he called up Chairman Deng in China and said, come on over, Chairman. We're going to have a nice little get-together, and we're going to bring you back into the global economic stage. And they taught China not capitalism. They taught China not free enterprise. They taught China technocracy. And that's why China is where it is today. And it's been identified by the global elite, by the way, as a technocracy. Not my words. I didn't make that analysis. The global elite themselves have said it. So now Klaus Schwab comes out and says, it's time for the big reset. And I'm thinking, okay, we knew it was coming, Klaus. We knew that you were behind it. You were part of that big clique, the global elite clique. You're just telling us what we should have already known. And I dare say, if my co-author Anthony Sutton were alive today, people have asked me this, what do you think Sutton would say? He would get up on a stage and he wasn't a man of a lot of words, by the way. He's really an academic. He'd get up on a stage and he'd say about 5 words, maybe just 4. He would say, I told you so. And he'd walk off the stage.